By the time the tent was up, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Darkness settled over the forest, and with it came the sounds of night, crickets, the distant howl of an animal, the occasional rustle of leaves. I turned on my headlamp to cook a simple dinner. Freeze-dried pasta with some sauce, heated on the small camping stove. I ate carefully, mindful of the wind, and drank some water. I double-checked my gear before crawling into the tent, laying out my sleeping bag and flashlight. The cold was starting to creep in, and I was glad I had packed a warm liner for the bag. Night brought a different kind of fear. The tent walls flapped with the wind, and the shadows outside seemed to move in strange ways. I could hear something walking nearby, branches snapping under weight. My first thought was a deer or some other wildlife, but as the footsteps drew closer, my heart began to race. I remained as still as possible, trying not to breathe too loudly, listening. The noise circled the tent, stopping at points, then moving again. I could hear heavy breathing that wasn't mine. I considered leaving, but the darkness outside made it nearly impossible to navigate safely. I had my knife within reach, my flashlight, and a basic sense of self-defense. I told myself that most likely it was a bear or a wild animal, and that making noise might either scare it away or provoke it. I stayed inside the tent, silent, heart pounding, waiting for the noise to pass. Hours felt like days. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my pulse spike. I didn't sleep much that night, if at all. Morning finally arrived, pale light filtering through the trees. I unzipped the tent cautiously and peeked outside. The forest looked calm, almost peaceful, but the traces of what had circled my tent the night before were clear. Broken branches, deep footprints, and flattened grass around my sleeping area. I realized I had been followed, or at least watched, by something much larger than a deer. My stomach sank. I packed my tent quickly, left nothing behind that could attract attention, and began retracing my steps along what I hoped was the original trail. The hike back was tense. Every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a twig, the call of a bird, the wind through the trees. I kept my head on a swivel, constantly scanning the perimeter. The path was harder to follow than before because I had wandered slightly from the main trail. I tried to mark my way with small pieces of cloth tied to branches, so I could backtrack if necessary. Hours passed, my legs ached, and my water supply was running low. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that panic would only slow me down. Midday brought a break. I sat on a fallen log, drank the last of my water, and looked at the map again. The GPS showed a road not far from my position, but the terrain between me and it was steep and rugged. I chose to follow a small stream downhill, reasoning that streams often lead to trails or roads. The forest around me had begun to thin, and I felt a small sense of hope, mixed with continued anxiety. By late afternoon, I finally spotted a dirt road winding through the trees. My heart leapt. I ran the last few hundred meters, careful not to twist an ankle on the uneven ground. When I reached the road, I spotted a parked car up ahead. I waved frantically and shouted, even though I had no idea if anyone would hear. After a few minutes, a man emerged from the car, surprised but helpful. He offered water and a ride back to town. I accepted without hesitation. As we drove down the mountain road, I glanced back at the forest. It looked calm and ordinary, almost friendly in the sunlight. But I knew the truth of what had happened there. I had been completely exposed, alone, with no guarantee of safety, and nothing but my own wits to rely on. The fear was real, tangible, and unforgettable. In the following days, I reflected on that trip. I realized how easily things could have gone wrong. I had underestimated the isolation, the unpredictability of wildlife, and the fragility of my situation in a place so far from help. I decided I would continue camping, but differently. I studied maps more carefully, invested in better gear, and learned more about wilderness survival. That trip taught me respect, vigilance, and the importance of preparation. Most importantly, it reminded me that nature is beautiful, but it is also indifferent, and you can never take its dangers lightly. The experience stayed with me, vivid and sharp, like a scar etched into memory. Every time I went back to the mountains, I thought about the darkness, the quiet footsteps outside my tent, and the feeling of being completely alone. But I also remembered the relief of reaching the road, the kindness of the stranger, and the satisfaction of having survived by keeping calm and focused. It was a terrifying experience, but it left me stronger, wiser, and far more respectful of the wilderness than I had ever been before. I had been planning this camping trip for months, carefully choosing a remote section of the forest far from the usual trails and highways. I wanted silence, solitude, and the raw experience of being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and the occasional bird or rustle of wind. I packed my backpack meticulously. A heavy-duty tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a small stove, enough food for a week, water filtration supplies, a first aid kit, a headlamp with extra batteries, a compass, a detailed topographical map, and a fixed blade knife. I even brought a small, collapsible hatchet for cutting firewood. Every item was carefully chosen to ensure I would survive if things went wrong. I drove as far as the car could go on the narrow, winding dirt roads, parking near the edge of a thick forest where the map indicated a small, unmarked clearing. The forest was dense, the trees older than anything I had seen in parks or recreational areas. Their trunks were massive, covered in moss and lichen, and the canopy blocked most of the sunlight. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches, leaves, and the occasional rock protruding from the earth like a hidden trap. The air smelled damp and earthy, and there was a constant hum of insects, a sound that would soon feel oppressive in the stillness. I began my hike into the forest carrying my full backpack. The weight pressed against my shoulders and back, but I was used to heavy loads from previous trips. My boots crunched on the dry leaves, and I carefully avoided unstable roots that could twist my ankle. The further I went, the quieter the forest became, oddly quiet for a place so full of life. Birds would occasionally call, but their songs felt distant, and the wind that rustled the leaves was strangely muted. It was as if the deeper I walked, the more the forest absorbed sound. After an hour of hiking, I came to the clearing I had aimed for, a roughly circular space surrounded by ancient pines and firs. It was smaller than I expected, but flat enough for a tent. I set up my tent meticulously, securing it with stakes and guy lines. I arranged my supplies inside, making sure my food and trash were sealed in waterproof containers to avoid attracting wildlife. Once the tent was ready, I decided to explore the immediate area to gather firewood. I cut dry branches from the lower parts of fallen trees, making sure they weren't rotting or too damp. By the time I had a decent pile, the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees, and shadows stretched across the clearing. I built a small fire pit using rocks I found nearby, careful to clear the area of leaves and twigs to prevent it from spreading. Night fell quickly in the forest. The canopy blocked the light, and it was as if darkness had arrived all at once. I lit my fire, and the flames cast flickering shadows across the clearing. The fire crackled and hissed, and for a while, the forest felt peaceful, almost inviting. I ate a small meal of dehydrated food and sipped water filtered from a nearby stream, listening to the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. The sound was easy to dismiss as an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. I set up my sleeping bag in the tent and lay down, trying to sleep, but the forest had other plans. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of movement just beyond the firelight. At first, it was subtle, a low rustling, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But then it became deliberate, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. I froze, my pulse quickening. The forest was supposed to be empty at this hour, and while I expected wildlife, the sound was heavier, deliberate. I reached for my knife, keeping low in the tent, straining my ears. The sound came closer, then stopped. Silence returned, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a weight. I couldn't see anything through the darkness, but I felt eyes on me, something big moving just out of sight. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every snap, every rustle. Occasionally, I caught the reflection of a dark shape at the edge of the firelight, moving just enough to suggest that something was circling the clearing. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, maybe a large deer, maybe even a pack of coyotes. But none of the sounds matched the way I knew these animals moved. This was heavier, calculated, deliberate. I had planned for wildlife, but nothing had prepared me for the raw, tense awareness that something large and unknown was out there, tracking me. By dawn, the sound had stopped, but the unease lingered. I stayed by the fire, examining the surrounding forest, noticing broken branches at unusual angles, deep tracks pressed into the soil, and flattened grass that suggested something had passed very recently. I could see the outline of a large animal, though the tracks didn't exactly match any animal I could name. My rational mind screamed it had to be a bear, but the behavior didn't fit. Bears are usually noisy, foraging, not deliberate and cautious. Whatever had been out there had been studying me, circling me with an intelligence that made the hair on my neck stand on end. I spent the next day cautiously foraging for more firewood, exploring the area to find natural barriers I could use if I needed protection. I made sure my fire burned all day, as I had read that the light and smoke can deter some animals. I also set up makeshift noise traps, strings of small rocks that would fall if stepped on, giving me some early warning if something approached. Every rustle, every movement in the corner of my vision made my heart race. My paranoia was building, but I refused to abandon the sight. I had planned for this trip, and I had come this far. The second night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again, heavier than before, this time accompanied by low, guttural growls. The fire had died down, and I had no way to see clearly outside the circle of dim embers. The growls were deliberate, almost communicating, and the snapping of branches suggested multiple sources moving together. I remembered my training. Stay calm, make yourself appear bigger, and be ready to defend yourself. I grabbed my hatchet and knife, keeping them close as I lay in the tent, my ears straining to catch every sound. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then the first direct contact happened. Something large smashed against a fallen log just a few meters from the tent. The impact was violent, and dirt and leaves flew into the firelight. The growls escalated into a chorus of snarls. I realized this wasn't just one animal. I was facing a group of large predators, likely bears, though their behavior was unlike any bear I had encountered in the wild. They seemed coordinated, almost tactical, testing the tent, the fire, and my presence. My survival instincts kicked in fully. I knew running into the forest would be fatal. I stayed low, trying to remain calm, gripping my hatchet tightly, ready to strike if they came closer. The night stretched endlessly. Every sound made me jump, my mind analyzing what it could mean. At one point, I thought I saw a massive shadow press against the tent wall, a black silhouette of something enormous. I stayed perfectly still, counting my breaths, reminding myself that sudden movement could provoke an attack. Hours passed like this, a nightmare in slow motion, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the canopy. The animals retreated with the coming light, leaving behind torn leaves, broken branches, and deep, fresh tracks circling my camp. I was alive but shaken to my core. Over the next day, I carefully packed my camp, checking every corner for signs that the animals might return. I avoided the obvious paths they had taken, moving in a zigzag pattern to confuse any trackers. I stayed calm, using every survival technique I knew, and slowly made my way back to the car. The forest felt less oppressive in daylight, but I kept my senses heightened, aware that the night could return at any moment. When I finally reached the dirt road and my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, exhausted, my body trembling from adrenaline and lack of sleep. Driving away, I reflected on the experience. I had survived because I had been prepared, cautious, and rational, even when fear threatened to overwhelm me. The forest had tested me in ways I had never anticipated, showing me the raw unpredictability of nature. I reported the tracks and encounters to the local ranger station, and they confirmed that the area had a known population of bears, but nothing had ever been documented behaving in such a coordinated, aggressive manner toward humans. It was an anomaly, a reminder that the wild is wild for a reason. In the following weeks, I recovered physically, but the mental impression lingered. I started documenting the experience in extreme detail, noting every sound, every movement, and every decision I had made. The story became a cautionary tale I shared with experienced hikers and campers. Never underestimate the unpredictability of wildlife. Always respect the forest, and prepare for the unexpected. The memory of that second night, the feeling of being circled by something massive, alive, and aware, stayed with me, but it also became a point of pride. I had faced a situation most people would never encounter and survived without panicking, without making a fatal mistake. Eventually, I returned to camping, but never in that area again. I learned to double-check all possible escape routes, to create safer perimeters, and to pay attention to the subtlest signs of animal behavior. The forest had taught me a harsh, unforgettable lesson. Survival depends not only on skill and preparation, but also on patience, awareness, and respect for the raw, unpredictable power of the natural world. By the time I finally put away my gear for the last time that season, I understood something profound. Fear is not weakness. It is information. It sharpens instincts, forces you to analyze, to observe, to move carefully. That terrifying experience in the dense forest had changed the way I approached the outdoors, the way I understood my own limits, and the way I measured risk. I would always carry that night with me, not as a memory of terror, but as a guide, a reminder that realism, preparation, and respect for nature are the only true defenses in the wilderness. I remember that camping trip as one of the scariest experiences of my life, not because anything magical or unreal happened, but because of how alone and vulnerable I felt in the wilderness. It started as a simple idea, a weekend escape into the mountains. I had been working nonstop for months, stuck in a routine of office lights and computer screens, and I wanted nothing more than the quiet of the forest, the smell of pine, and the feeling of dirt under my boots. I packed carefully, bringing the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food that didn't need refrigeration, a water filter, a small first aid kit, a headlamp, and a basic camping stove. I made sure my phone was fully charged, even though I knew that cell service would likely vanish once I drove past the small town at the base of the mountain trail. The drive up the winding road to the trailhead was uneventful, almost too peaceful. The sunlight bounced off the trees, the wind stirred the branches, and I could hear birds in the distance. I parked my car in the small dirt lot and double-checked my pack. I knew the trail was about 12 miles round trip to the small clearing where I planned to set up camp. The guidebook said it was moderately difficult, but it also mentioned that people sometimes got lost if they didn't pay attention to the markers. I had a map, a compass, and a GPS app as backup. I was confident. At first, the hike was beautiful. The trail snaked along a narrow ridge, giving me glimpses of the valley below. I could see the winding river reflecting the sun in spots like a silver ribbon. The air smelled clean, and my lungs felt full for the first time in months. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe a fox. Occasionally, a squirrel would dart across the path, its tiny claws scratching against the bark as it scurried up a tree. The forest felt alive, but not threatening. Not yet. Around midday, I reached a small stream. I took off my pack, sat on a rock, and drank some water. I filtered it with my portable device, careful not to get sick from something avoidable. I had a granola bar and some nuts, and I ate slowly, savoring the quiet. The sound of the water running over the stones was soothing, and I thought about how lucky I was to have found a spot this untouched, this private. I refilled my water bottle, tightened my backpack straps, and started moving again. The trail began to climb sharply, and I could feel the burn in my legs. Sweat ran down my back, and I adjusted my hat to keep the sun out of my eyes. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange. The trail markers were farther apart than I remembered from the map. First, I thought it was just poor maintenance, or that I had missed a turn. I checked my GPS, and it showed the trail continuing, but I felt uneasy. My gut was tense, that low, nagging warning that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing. I pressed on. After an hour of climbing, the forest began to thin, and I reached a ridge with a clear view of the mountains ahead. I paused to catch my breath and admire the scenery, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me. The trail ahead seemed less defined, and there were fallen branches and rocks that could have been easily avoided on a maintained path. I realized that the trail markers had vanished entirely. I stopped, took out the map, and tried to orient myself. The GPS still showed I was close to the clearing, but I knew that technology could fail, and in the backcountry, relying on it blindly was dangerous. I spent a good half hour trying to figure out the trail. There were no footprints, no clear path, just the natural slope of the ridge and the scattered trees. I took a deep breath and decided to follow what looked like an old path. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it seemed to go in the right direction. I reminded myself to stay calm. Panic was worse than being lost. Step by step, I moved forward, careful not to trip on roots or rocks. By late afternoon, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The forest had grown quieter. Birds were still chirping occasionally, but their calls were sparse. A cool wind began to stir, brushing through the pines and rustling the dry leaves underfoot. I realized I hadn't seen any signs of other people for hours. That should have been comforting, but instead, it made me feel isolated. I kept checking my GPS, which still showed I was close to the clearing, but the distance seemed longer than it should have been. I finally came to a small, flat area that could have been the clearing I was aiming for. It was hard to tell because it was overgrown with shrubs and small trees. I set down my pack, took a deep breath, and tried to scout a suitable spot for my tent. I noticed that the wind had picked up, and the forest around me was eerily still in some areas. The leaves didn't move, and there was a strange silence that pressed on my ears. I ignored it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I set up the tent slowly, securing the stakes and making sure the rainfly was properly attached, even though the forecast showed clear skies. I had been planning this camping trip for months, carefully choosing a remote section of the forest far from the usual trails and highways. I wanted silence, solitude, and the raw experience of being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and the occasional bird or rustle of wind. I packed my backpack meticulously. A heavy-duty tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a small stove, enough food for a week, water filtration supplies, a first aid kit, a headlamp with extra batteries, a compass, a detailed topographical map, and a fixed blade knife. I even brought a small, collapsible hatchet for cutting firewood. Every item was carefully chosen to ensure I would survive if things went wrong. I drove as far as the car could go on the narrow, winding dirt roads, parking near the edge of a thick forest where the map indicated a small, unmarked clearing. The forest was dense, the trees older than anything I had seen in parks or recreational areas. Their trunks were massive, covered in moss and lichen, and the canopy blocked most of the sunlight. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches, leaves, and the occasional rock protruding from the earth like a hidden trap. The air smelled damp and earthy, and there was a constant hum of insects, a sound that would soon feel oppressive in the stillness. I began my hike into the forest carrying my full backpack. The weight pressed against my shoulders and back, but I was used to heavy loads from previous trips. My boots crunched on the dry leaves, and I carefully avoided unstable roots that could twist my ankle. The further I went, the quieter the forest became, oddly quiet for a place so full of life. Birds would occasionally call, but their songs felt distant, and the wind that rustled the leaves was strangely muted. It was as if the deeper I walked, the more the forest absorbed sound. After an hour of hiking, I came to the clearing I had aimed for, a roughly circular space surrounded by ancient pines and firs. It was smaller than I expected, but flat enough for a tent. I set up my tent meticulously, securing it with stakes and guy lines. I arranged my supplies inside, making sure my food and trash were sealed in waterproof containers to avoid attracting wildlife. Once the tent was ready, I decided to explore the immediate area to gather firewood. I cut dry branches from the lower parts of fallen trees, making sure they weren't rotting or too damp. By the time I had a decent pile, the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees, and shadows stretched across the clearing. I built a small fire pit using rocks I found nearby, careful to clear the area of leaves and twigs to prevent it from spreading. Night fell quickly in the forest. The canopy blocked the light, and it was as if darkness had arrived all at once. I lit my fire, and the flames cast flickering shadows across the clearing. The fire crackled and hissed, and for a while, the forest felt peaceful, almost inviting. I ate a small meal of dehydrated food and sipped water filtered from a nearby stream, listening to the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. The sound was easy to dismiss as an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. I set up my sleeping bag in the tent and lay down, trying to sleep, but the forest had other plans. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of movement just beyond the firelight. At first, it was subtle, a low rustling, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But then it became deliberate, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. I froze, my pulse quickening. The forest was supposed to be empty at this hour, and while I expected wildlife, the sound was heavier, deliberate. I reached for my knife, keeping low in the tent, straining my ears. The sound came closer, then stopped. Silence returned, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a weight. I couldn't see anything through the darkness, but I felt eyes on me, something big moving just out of sight. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every snap, every rustle. Occasionally, I caught the reflection of a dark shape at the edge of the firelight, moving just enough to suggest that something was circling the clearing. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, maybe a large deer, maybe even a pack of coyotes. But none of the sounds matched the way I knew these animals moved. This was heavier, calculated, deliberate. I had planned for wildlife, but nothing had prepared me for the raw, tense awareness that something large and unknown was out there, tracking me. By dawn, the sound had stopped, but the unease lingered. I stayed by the fire, examining the surrounding forest, noticing broken branches at unusual angles, deep tracks pressed into the soil, and flattened grass that suggested something had passed very recently. I could see the outline of a large animal, though the tracks didn't exactly match any animal I could name. My rational mind screamed it had to be a bear, but the behavior didn't fit. Bears are usually noisy, foraging, not deliberate and cautious. Whatever had been out there had been studying me, circling me with an intelligence that made the hair on my neck stand on end. I had been planning this camping trip for months, but even with all the preparation, nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. I had chosen a remote spot deep in the forest, far from roads, far from people, a place where the only sounds I would hear would be the wind through the trees, the occasional bird, or the rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. I wanted solitude, a chance to disconnect completely from everything. Phones, emails, city noise, the constant pull of responsibility. I wanted a weekend where I could exist entirely on my own, carrying nothing but what I could fit on my back. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The air was crisp, tinged with the smell of wet earth and pine. I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, checked my gear once more, and set off. The path was narrow and winding, a single dirt track lined with trees that arched over me, creating a tunnel of green. At first, the walk was invigorating. The forest was alive with light and movement. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the path. Birds called to one another, and a small brook ran alongside the trail, its water clear and cool. I walked for hours, stopping only occasionally to drink from my water bottle or adjust the weight of my pack. The trail was not well marked, and I relied on my map and compass to guide me. It wasn't until late afternoon that I found a spot that felt right for camping. A small clearing opened up in the trees, with a flat area for my tent and a fire ring already set up by someone else, I assumed, who had camped here before. There were no footprints beyond the clearing, no signs of recent human presence. It was as though the forest had kept this place untouched, waiting for someone like me. I set up my tent carefully, staking it down against the wind, and laid out my sleeping bag and supplies. The firewood I gathered was damp from the morning dew, but I managed to get a fire going after a while. Smoke spiraled into the treetops, and the warmth it gave off was comforting. I ate a simple meal of canned beans and rice, feeling that deep satisfaction that comes from preparing your own food, completely detached from the conveniences of civilization. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. Shadows stretched and darkened, and the air cooled. The sounds of the day faded, replaced by the subtle, almost imperceptible noises of night, crickets, the rustling of small animals, the distant call of an owl. At first, everything felt serene. I sat by the fire for a long time, watching the flames dance, thinking about nothing and everything at once. But as the night deepened, I began to feel an unease creeping over me. It was not fear in the traditional sense, not a response to something I could see or hear, but a gnawing sense that I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. The forest could play tricks on the mind, especially at night when shapes and sounds shifted in the dark. Still, I could not shake the feeling. I went into the tent to sleep, rolling out my sleeping bag and trying to calm myself. I lay there for hours listening to the night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I tried to remind myself that I was alone, that no one could be here, that I had chosen this place for its isolation. But the fear did not fade. It only grew heavier. Around midnight, I finally drifted off into a restless sleep. I woke suddenly to a sharp noise, something outside the tent. My first thought was a deer or some other animal. The forest was full of them. But this noise was different. It was deliberate, a slow, dragging sound, like someone pulling something heavy across the ground. My stomach tightened. I stayed still, listening, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The sound moved closer, then stopped, then started again, this time in a pattern that did not make sense for any animal I knew. It came from just beyond the edge of the clearing, just past the firelight, where the shadows pressed against the trees. I did not move. I could not. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab my flashlight, to do something, but I stayed frozen. Then I heard another noise. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the clearing. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper? That was impossible. I had not seen anyone else on the trail, and it was late. There was no reason for anyone to be here, and yet the sounds were real. They were close, too close. I waited for what felt like hours. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent, and then the dragging sound returned, moving around the perimeter. I could not see anything, but I could sense movement in the dark. The air grew colder, sharper. My hands were sweating despite the chill. I wanted to call for help, to scream, but my voice seemed to have disappeared. I could only lie there and hope. Eventually, the sounds receded. I could hear the steps moving back into the forest, fading into the distance. I did not move for a long time, afraid that even a single sound from me would draw attention. When I finally mustered the courage to peek out of the tent, everything seemed quiet, peaceful almost. But I knew it was not. Something had been here, something that had known I was alone, that had come into my space with a purpose I could not yet understand. I decided to leave at first light. There was no way I could stay another night in that clearing. I packed my gear quickly, careful not to make noise. The forest felt different in the early morning light. Still beautiful, still alive, but charged with the memory of the night's events. As I hiked back along the trail, every snap of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth made me tense. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, moving faster than I had the day before, my backpack cutting into my shoulders. Hours passed. The trail twisted and turned, and I was careful to follow it exactly, knowing that one wrong turn could leave me lost. I passed familiar landmarks from my hike in, but nothing felt reassuring anymore. Everything reminded me of the sounds I had heard, of the way I had felt trapped in my own campsite. My mind kept replaying scenarios, imagining what might have happened if I had stepped outside the tent, if I had confronted whoever or whatever was there. The possibilities were terrifying, but I had no choice but to keep moving. By midday, I finally reached the trailhead. My legs were sore, my back ached, but the sight of cars and other people felt like a miracle. The world had returned to its normal rhythm. The smell of exhaust, the chatter of hikers, the mundane noises of the parking lot. I felt a strange relief, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I had made it out intact, and I had survived what I now understood was more than just an encounter with the wilderness. I had faced the raw unpredictability of someone else's presence, a human element I had never accounted for. I reported the incident to the park authorities, describing the sounds and movements I had experienced. They took it seriously, though there was little they could do without concrete evidence. They assured me that the forest was monitored and that such intrusions were rare, but they advised caution and suggested that campers never assume they are completely alone. I left the park that day with a mix of relief and lingering unease, the forest behind me both familiar and alien. The experience stayed with me for months. I could not shake the memory of that night, the sense of being watched, the deliberate, calculated movements around my campsite. It changed the way I approached the outdoors. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, cautious in ways I had never been before. I never returned to that trail, but I did not stop camping altogether. Instead, I learned to respect the wilderness not only for its natural dangers, but for the unpredictability of human behavior within it. I carried that lesson forward every time I set out again, every time I pitched a tent, every time I walked along a seemingly empty trail. The forest had taught me that even in solitude, one is never truly alone, and the awareness of that fact can make all the difference between safety and disaster. I had always liked camping alone. There was something about being deep in the forest, miles away from people, that gave me a sense of control and quiet I couldn't find anywhere else. I packed my gear carefully the night before: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, extra food, a first aid kit, a small hand axe, flashlight, and a few batteries. I double-checked everything because I had a habit of being overly cautious, which usually worked in my favor. I wanted to be self-sufficient, and I had been camping alone multiple times. But this trip was different. I was heading to a part of the forest I had never explored before, a more remote section several hours hike from the nearest road. I started early in the morning, just as the sun began to rise. The air was crisp and cold, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the crunch of my boots against dried leaves and pine needles. The trail was narrow, winding through thick undergrowth and uneven terrain. I moved slowly, enjoying the solitude, occasionally stopping to take photos of the rising sun through the trees. The forest had a calmness to it, almost like it was holding its breath, and I felt myself relax in the quiet rhythm of the walk. After about 4 hours, I reached a clearing near a small stream. The water ran clear and cold over smooth rocks, and the area was surrounded by tall, old trees. I decided this would be my campsite. I picked a spot slightly elevated from the stream to avoid any risk of flooding, set down my pack, and began to unpack. Setting up my tent was routine, but I took extra care to position it so that it would be shielded from the wind and somewhat hidden from sight. Once the tent was secure, I laid out my sleeping bag and organized my supplies. I built a small fire pit using stones I gathered from nearby, cleared of dry leaves and twigs. I always liked to prepare thoroughly, even in small ways, because I knew that attention to detail could make the difference between comfort and danger in the wilderness. As I finished setting up, I noticed the forest around me beginning to shift with the light. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, and the sounds of birds quieted. There was a sense that the forest was settling into night. I started a small fire, enough for warmth and to cook some food, and sat back to eat a simple meal of canned beans and bread. The fire crackled, and the warmth felt comforting, but I also felt a slight unease. It was subtle, the kind of feeling that creeps in when you're alone and in unfamiliar territory. My senses sharpened, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of water, even the occasional snap of a branch sounded louder and closer. As night fell completely, I extinguished the small fire, leaving just a few embers to keep some warmth. I had learned long ago not to leave fires unattended at night, especially in a dry forest. I went inside my tent, zipped it up fully, and switched on my flashlight. I wanted to read for a bit before sleeping, but the darkness outside was thick, pressing against the thin walls of the tent. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but there was a tension I couldn't shake. Every sound, an animal rustling, a branch breaking, or even the wind moving through the trees, made me tense. I reminded myself that animals were usually more afraid of humans than we were of them, but still, the thought didn't ease my nerves. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something outside. At first, I thought it was a branch falling or a small animal, but then I realized it was a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like something dragging across the forest floor. My heart started to race, and I froze, listening carefully. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could hear the subtle crunch of leaves and small twigs under weight. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, wolf, or some other large animal. But the dragging quality of the sound didn't fit. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it out of the tent's small opening. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the trees, but I saw nothing. I stayed still for several minutes, holding my breath and straining my ears. Then I heard it again, unmistakable. Heavy footsteps moving deliberately toward my campsite. I felt my stomach drop. I had always been prepared for animals, but this sound, it didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was methodical, slow, and too large to be a deer or coyote. My mind jumped to worst-case scenarios. I had a small axe in my tent, my knife on my belt, and a lighter for emergency fire, but being inside a tent gave me almost no defense. I considered leaving immediately, but the thought of stepping out into the dark, into unknown territory, was terrifying. I kept my flashlight steady, trying to pierce the shadows. The steps stopped just outside the tent. Silence fell, broken only by the distant sound of the stream. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I heard something else, the scrape of a metal object being moved along the ground. Panic gripped me. Whoever or whatever was outside was inspecting my campsite. My mind raced. Could it be a poacher, someone else camping illegally, or something even worse? I had no way to know. I stayed perfectly still, my body tense, listening. I remembered the small emergency whistle I always kept in my pack. I considered using it, but that could provoke the person outside, and I didn't know if there were more than one. Instead, I did what I had learned from survival guides. I stayed quiet, kept calm, and waited. I told myself not to panic, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the sound moved away. I didn't breathe fully until the footsteps receded and the scrape faded into the distance. I stayed in the tent, trembling, too afraid to move or even think about sleep. I realized then that my sense of security in the forest was fragile, that being alone made you vulnerable in ways you couldn't fully prepare for. The rest of the night was tense. Every sound, every shift of wind through the trees, made me jump. I didn't dare leave the tent until dawn. When the first light broke, I cautiously unzipped the tent and looked around. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of someone else. The campsite appeared untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had heard. My stomach twisted with unease, but I reminded myself I had survived the night. That was something. I broke down camp slowly, my movements deliberate, and packed everything into my backpack. I decided to hike out immediately rather than staying another night. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less oppressive but still watching, still holding memories of the night. Every branch, every shadow, reminded me of what had happened. I moved quickly but carefully, retracing my steps along the trail. I constantly scanned the forest, my senses sharp. On the way back, I found signs of human activity that I hadn't noticed before. Old markers, footprints, a small campsite that seemed abandoned. It made me think that this area, while remote, was not entirely untouched. Someone else had been there recently. That thought was both comforting and unnerving. I kept moving, my legs burning with fatigue, but I forced myself not to slow down. I thought about the next person who might wander into that same clearing and warned myself about what could happen if they weren't as cautious as I was. By mid-afternoon, I emerged from the forest onto a dirt road I recognized. Relief washed over me in waves. I looked back at the line of trees and felt a mixture of fear and gratitude. I had survived, unscathed, but the experience had left a mark on me. The forest was no longer just a place of solitude and peace. It was a place where danger could exist quietly, unexpectedly, and without warning. I realized that camping alone in remote areas required more than gear and experience. It required vigilance, caution, and a deep respect for the unpredictability of the environment. When I reached my car, I sat for a long time, breathing heavily, still processing the night. I had food, water, and a warm vehicle. I checked my supplies, ensuring nothing had been stolen or damaged. The normalcy of the road, the presence of civilization, and the hum of my car engine were comforting. I drove home slowly, replaying the events in my mind, analyzing every detail, trying to understand what I had experienced. I knew I would return to camping, but not to that section of the forest, not alone, and not without added precautions. The experience taught me about limits, caution, and the delicate balance of solitude in the wilderness. I had faced fear head-on, stayed calm under extreme stress, and survived without incident. When I finally walked into my apartment that evening, I unpacked my gear meticulously, storing everything carefully. I checked every zipper, every lock, every strap, making sure I was ready for the next trip, but this time, better prepared. I also took a long shower, letting the warm water wash away the tension in my muscles, the chills in my body, and the remnants of fear in my mind. That night, I slept deeply, finally able to let go of the constant anxiety of the previous night. In the morning, I reviewed my plans, making notes on safety, potential escape routes, and signs of human presence in future locations. I realized that fear was not something to avoid, but something to respect and use to guide careful decisions. The forest had tested me, shown me my vulnerabilities, and in a way had strengthened my survival skills and awareness. I knew I could return someday, but I also knew that wilderness could hold unexpected threats, and being prepared mentally and physically was the only way to face them safely. In the end, the night had been terrifying, but it had ended with clarity and survival. I had learned to respect the unpredictability of the forest, to trust my instincts, and to maintain control in moments of panic. The experience stayed with me, a reminder that even in the most beautiful, serene places, danger could exist silently. But facing it, preparing for it, and emerging intact had changed the way I saw camping forever. I felt stronger, more aware, and ready for whatever came next. Always cautious, always alert, but never again unprepared. It was late summer when I decided to take a camping trip alone. I had spent the last few months buried in work, with no real break, no chance to breathe, and I needed something different, something quiet and far from people. I had planned it carefully, as I always did, checking maps, weather forecasts, and even reading reports on the area I intended to go. The location I chose was remote, a stretch of forest that few people visited, with a small clearing near a river. The idea was simple: hike in, set up camp, spend a few days living off the trail, and then leave. Nothing fancy, nothing too risky. I told myself it was going to be a simple, peaceful escape. I started early in the morning. My pack was heavy but organized. I had food, a first aid kit, my tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, a headlamp, batteries, a few extra layers of clothing, and the usual hiking gear. The trail was narrow and winding, passing through dense forest. First, the hike was serene. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting uneven patterns on the ground. Birds called from the branches above, and a faint breeze rustled the leaves. I felt my tension easing with every step. The first few hours were easy, almost meditative, and I let myself fall into a rhythm. Step, breath, hearing only the forest and my own movements. By midday, I had covered more ground than I expected. The terrain became steeper, rocks and roots threatening to trip me at every step. My legs began to ache, and my backpack felt heavier than before, but I welcomed the challenge. There was a raw satisfaction in pushing my body and mind like this. By the time I reached the clearing near the river, the sun was already tilting, the light warmer, softer. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick trees on three sides, with the river forming the fourth boundary. It was beautiful. The water ran fast and clear, and I could see small fish darting near the surface. I set my pack down, feeling a quiet relief. Finally, I was here, alone exactly as I wanted. I spent the next hour setting up my camp. I chose a flat spot just slightly raised from the riverbank, enough to stay dry if the water rose, but close enough to hear the sound of flowing water all night. The tent went up smoothly, the stakes sinking into soft dirt, and I arranged my sleeping bag inside. I gathered firewood, careful to take only dry sticks and branches, and set up a small campfire circle. By late afternoon, I had a fire going. The smell of smoke mixed with the damp earth and leaves around me, and I prepared my first meal. Canned beans and rice, heated over the small stove. Eating in the middle of the forest, with only the river and the wind as company, gave me a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. As the sun dipped lower, shadows grew longer. The forest around me darkened. The noise of birds ceased, replaced by the occasional rustle of small animals and the distant croak of frogs near the river. I sat near the fire, listening. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But as darkness fell, I realized just how isolated I really was. I could no longer see past the immediate clearing. Every tree beyond the firelight became a black silhouette, twisting and moving in the wind. I felt a strange edge of vulnerability, but I told myself it was normal. Alone in the forest at night, you naturally feel exposed. The first sign that something was off came just after the stars appeared. I had gone to refill my water bottle from the river and noticed a series of footprints in the mud along the bank. They were too large for any small animal I could think of and spaced in a way that suggested they belonged to a human. I froze, looking around. The clearing was empty. I had arrived here alone, and there was no sign anyone else had been in the area. The footprints seemed fresh. I traced them carefully, but they disappeared into the trees to the north. My heart rate quickened. I reminded myself that it could be a hiker who had passed earlier in the day, but something felt wrong. The prints were too recent. Back at my camp, I tried to calm myself. I closed the tent, secured my food, and sat near the fire, listening for any sound that would indicate someone's presence. The forest was alive, but nothing seemed unusual. Just the river, the wind, and the night animals. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to go to bed early, telling myself that daylight would make everything safer. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound, a crackling, like broken twigs under heavy feet. I froze, listening. The sound was outside, coming from the direction of the river. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or something similar, but the pace and weight of the steps didn't match. Whatever it was moving deliberately, not like a random animal wandering. My chest tightened. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slightly to peer out. The fire had died down to embers, but in the faint glow I could see movement at the edge of the clearing. A shadow passed between the trees. I wanted to call out, to make my presence known, but something in me told me to stay quiet. Whoever or whatever it was might be armed, dangerous, or just as startled by me as I was by them. I felt my fingers tighten around the flashlight, weighing the decision. Should I get my backpack and try to move? Should I stay and hope they leave? My mind raced and my body felt frozen. The shadow moved closer, just to the edge of the firelight. Then silence. The hours that followed were unbearable. I stayed in the tent, motionless, listening to every sound. Every rustle, every snapping branch made me jump. I refused to make a sound, fearing it might attract attention. My mind imagined every possible scenario, from an armed stranger lost in the woods to someone following me intentionally. I tried to remind myself of probabilities, that the forest was vast and it was unlikely someone was watching me, but logic couldn't overcome instinct. My heart refused to slow. By morning, the shadow had not returned, or at least I didn't see it again. The sun filtered through the trees, and I felt slightly calmer. I examined the clearing carefully, looking for footprints or any sign that someone had been near the tent. There were faint tracks, human-sized, but they had vanished into the denser forest. I packed my things quickly, realizing I didn't want to stay another night. I left the fire embers smoldering and started my hike back. The journey back was tense. Every sound, every movement in the trees felt like someone following me. I kept my pace steady but fast, my senses hyper-aware. Hours passed before I finally reached a part of the trail where I knew I could be visible from the main path. There were people around, hikers and campers, and the normal noise of life in the forest returned. Relief washed over me like a wave. When I finally got back to my car, parked on the edge of the forest where the trail began, I sat for a long time before moving. The sense of danger, the fear of being watched, didn't leave immediately. I realized that I had underestimated the vulnerability of being alone in a remote area. I had thought I was prepared, that careful planning was enough, but the encounter, whatever it had been, reminded me that some situations can't be predicted or controlled. A few weeks later, I read a local report about a series of robberies near remote trailheads in the region I had visited. Hikers had been approached by unknown individuals at night, and some had been threatened or attacked. I realized then that what I had experienced wasn't imagination, wasn't just fear. It had been real. Whoever had been near my campsite likely intended harm, but had left when they realized someone was awake or alert. Since then, I've camped again, but always with caution. I never go alone into such remote areas. I check in with friends, I carry communication devices, and I avoid camping spots that are too isolated. The memory of that night in the clearing has stayed with me, a reminder of the thin line between peace and danger in the wilderness. I learned that preparation can only go so far. The forest, while beautiful and calming, is also unpredictable. Awareness and respect for that unpredictability became my rule. Looking back, I'm grateful for surviving without harm. I left the forest without confrontation, without injury, and with my senses sharpened. The experience changed how I approached outdoor adventures, how I viewed solitude, and how I respected the unseen presence of other humans in places I once thought were empty. That night remains the clearest lesson I've ever had. No matter how prepared you are, the wilderness can still remind you that danger can be closer than you think, even without a single creature looking to harm you physically. Survival isn't always about fighting. It's often about awareness, caution, and timing. I had been planning the camping trip for months, going over every small detail in my head. I wanted a place that was remote enough to feel isolated, but not so far that I'd be in danger if something went wrong. I finally settled on a stretch of national forest several hours from the nearest town. The map showed a small, narrow trail leading to a clearing near a river, surrounded by dense woods. The idea was to hike in with a light pack, spend a few days in the forest, and then hike back out. I told myself that I was ready for solitude, ready for the kind of silence that presses against your chest at night when there's nothing but the rustling trees and the occasional call of wildlife. I packed carefully. My backpack was heavy but balanced. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 3 days, extra water, first aid kit, a map, a compass, a flashlight, batteries, a knife, and a lighter. I even brought rope and a small hatchet, just in case I needed to make a fire if the stove failed. I left early in the morning, driving along narrow forest roads, watching the landscape slowly turn wilder. The closer I got, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no power lines, only trees and the occasional dirt road disappearing into the forest. By late morning, I parked at the trailhead. The sign warned that the trail was unmaintained and that hikers should be experienced. I took a deep breath, tightened the straps of my pack, and began the hike. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and muddy from recent rains. It snaked between tall pines and oaks, with thick underbrush pressing in on either side. My boots sank into soft soil, and the air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. Every few minutes, I heard twigs snap behind me. At first, I thought it was my own feet, but then I caught the echo of a noise slightly out of rhythm with my steps. Maybe an animal, I told myself. A deer, a fox, nothing dangerous. Hours passed, and the forest grew denser. I stopped occasionally to rest, drink water, and check my map. The trail became less obvious, covered by fallen branches and thick undergrowth. I had to push through brambles at times, scraping my arms and legs. By the time I reached the clearing near the river, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The clearing was small but open enough for a tent. The river ran gently nearby, its water clear and cold. I could see rocks and fallen branches beneath the surface. It was beautiful and quiet. Perfect. I set up my tent, made a small fire pit, and collected dry wood nearby. Gathering wood was harder than I expected. Everything was damp from the earlier rain. I broke small branches with my hands and used my knife to shave kindling. When the fire finally caught, it felt like a small triumph. The flames crackled, and I felt the warmth against my skin as the forest darkened. I cooked a simple meal on my stove, ate slowly, and then settled into my sleeping bag. The sky above was clear, filled with stars. The air was cold but not unbearable. The first night was uneventful. I woke a few times, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the murmur of the river. Everything seemed normal, but as the second day began, I started to notice small, unsettling things. Footprints, not deer tracks or any animal I recognized. Human footprints, large, deep, and fresh in the mud near my tent and along the riverbank. I froze the first time I saw them. My stomach tightened. I had told myself I wasn't far from civilization, that maybe a hiker had passed through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The prints didn't lead far. They disappeared into the dense forest. I tried to keep calm and focus on practical matters. I hiked upstream to explore, keeping my knife accessible. The trail was rough and the forest grew wilder. I noticed broken branches, disturbed underbrush, and in one spot a makeshift trap of sorts, a thin rope tied between two trees at knee height. Someone had been here recently, and not for hiking or camping. My pulse quickened, but I told myself not to panic. Maybe it was hunters. Maybe it was just someone strange passing through. But still, the unease settled deep in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle in the dark made me jump. The fire had burned low, and I kept it alive, watching shadows dance across the clearing. Around midnight, I heard something that made my heart pound. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the clearing. I froze under my blanket, listening as the crunch of leaves grew closer, then receded, then returned. The forest was silent otherwise. My mind raced. I had my knife, yes, but could I defend myself against someone bigger, stronger, determined? I considered hiking out immediately, but the thought of walking blind in the dark, through thick forest, was terrifying. Morning came, but the fear didn't ease. I packed quickly, ate a small breakfast, and decided to hike back before things escalated. The prints were still there, leading in multiple directions, some circling my tent, some heading deeper into the woods. I chose the main trail and moved quickly, scanning every shadow, every tree line. The forest that had seemed peaceful now felt oppressive, like it was closing in. Branches scratched my face, roots grabbed my boots, and every sound made me flinch. Hours into the hike, I heard it again. Snapping twigs, low murmurs, not animal sounds, human. I broke into a run, my backpack heavy but manageable, my heart hammering. I tried to stay on the trail, but it was narrow and winding. The sounds followed me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always just out of sight. I thought about shouting, but I realized whoever or whatever it was might respond, might chase. I kept running, ignoring the pain in my legs and the sweat stinging my eyes. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto a small dirt road. My relief was immense. I ran down the road, waving my arms whenever a car passed. Finally, a truck slowed, and the driver stopped. I climbed in, panting and shaking, explaining that I had been lost and that someone had been following me. The driver nodded, understanding in his eyes. He dropped me at the nearest town. I called the authorities, gave them the location of the trailhead, the footprints, and everything I had seen. They said they would investigate. That night, safe in a motel bed, I tried to sleep. My body ached. My mind replayed every moment in the forest. I knew I was lucky. Whatever was out there, hunters, poachers, or something worse, hadn't caught me. But I couldn't shake the fear, the feeling of eyes watching me from the trees, the sound of footsteps circling my tent in the dead of night. In the days that followed, I read reports from the area. Authorities had found evidence of illegal hunting camps and traps. They warned hikers to avoid that trail. The forest that had seemed so inviting, so serene, was dangerous in ways I hadn't anticipated. I realized that being prepared with gear wasn't enough. Awareness, instinct, and respect for the fact that people could be unpredictable in the wild mattered just as much. I returned home, forever changed. I still camp, but only in designated areas with other people around. The memory of that trail, of the footprints circling my tent, of running through the dense forest with someone unseen behind me, never left me. I had survived, yes, but I had been lucky. And luck, I learned, could run out faster than you think in the wilderness. Even now, when I hear about remote camping, I remember that forest. I remember the river, the clearing, the fire, and the footprints. I remember the fear of knowing someone else was there, close, silent, watching. And I know I will never, ever take that kind of isolation for granted again. I had been planning the trip for months. It wasn't anything fancy, just a solo weekend camping trip in a remote stretch of forest a few hours' drive from the nearest town. I wanted to get away from the constant hum of city life, the traffic, the lights, the noise. I wanted something raw and quiet, a place where I could hear my own heartbeat, the wind through the trees, the occasional call of a bird or rustle of a small animal. I packed my bag meticulously, making sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, fire starter, first aid kit, flashlight with extra batteries, and a small folding knife. I wanted to be as self-sufficient as possible. I had done this before, though never this far into isolation. The drive itself was long and winding. The closer I got to the forest, the narrower and rougher the road became. Gravel replaced asphalt, and deep ruts indicated that cars didn't come this way often. There were stretches where I had to slow down to a crawl, maneuvering around rocks and deep potholes. I could see the forest looming ahead, dense and green, with tall pines and oaks creating a wall of foliage. There was no cell phone signal here, I knew, but that was part of the appeal. No distractions, no constant connection to the outside world. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already leaning toward the horizon. The forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural at first. No cars, no planes, no dogs barking, no people walking. Just a stillness that was almost too complete. I parked on the edge of a small clearing and unloaded my gear. The clearing wasn't large, but it had enough flat ground for my tent, and a small area for a fire pit I could make safely away from the surrounding trees. I set everything down, methodically laying out my tent, staking it securely, and checking that the sleeping bag and supplies were all in order. Once the tent was up, I gathered wood for a fire. I collected dry branches, twigs, and pieces of bark, stacking them neatly. I wanted a fire before dark. It was important not only for warmth but for a sense of security. Darkness in this part of the forest was absolute, and I didn't want to stumble blindly in it. Once the fire was lit, the flames crackled and danced, casting long shadows on the trees. I sat back on a fallen log, ate some trail mix, and drank water, letting the solitude sink in. As the sun disappeared completely, the forest transformed. Shadows became deeper, and the sounds of nocturnal life began to emerge. The occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the scurry of something small moving through underbrush. I stayed close to the fire, feeling the heat on my skin, knowing it was my safeguard against the unseen. I didn't hear anything unusual at first, but then came a sound that made me pause. A branch snapping, somewhere off the edge of the clearing. It wasn't unusual for wildlife, but there was a rhythm to it that felt deliberate, cautious. I tightened my grip on my knife and scanned the dark beyond the firelight. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a deer or some raccoon. The rational part of me knew it was nothing to worry about. I spent the next few hours tending the fire, occasionally tossing on small pieces of wood, watching the flames and letting my mind wander. Darkness had a way of magnifying every little sound. A gust of wind would shake branches, making them creak. A small animal would brush against dead leaves, sending a crisp rustling sound echoing across the clearing. I remained alert but tried not to let paranoia creep in. Around midnight, I realized I needed sleep. The fire had burned low, so I moved a few of the larger logs closer to the tent and covered them with smaller twigs and branches to keep the flames going long enough for me to drift off. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up tightly, and lay on my back staring at the faint outlines of trees against the night sky, partially illuminated by the moon. First, it was peaceful. Then I heard it again. A snap, followed by another, then a slow crunching of leaves. It was closer this time, unmistakably moving toward the clearing. I froze. The forest felt suddenly suffocating, each shadow a potential threat. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the sound would carry. I sat up slowly, reaching for my flashlight, trying to peer into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The beam cut through the blackness in a thin line, revealing nothing. Yet the sound persisted, advancing slowly, methodically. I knew it wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, deliberate. Finally, I saw the clearing. It was smaller than I remembered from the map, surrounded by thick trees, with a stream cutting through one side. The ground was flat enough for my tent, and there was a natural circle cleared of brush and fallen branches. I set down my pack, trying to calm myself. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the tent and began staking it into the damp soil. I felt exposed, like the forest was watching. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I tried to focus on the practical tasks. Assembling the stove, setting up the sleeping area, organizing my gear. By the time I had finished, the sun was nearly gone. Twilight had settled in, casting a gray light over the forest. I started a small fire in the stone ring I had assembled, feeding it dry twigs I had collected. The smoke rose in thin spirals, and the warmth of the fire was comforting. I sat back against a log and listened. First, it was peaceful. I thought I could relax. Then I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere in the trees, not far from my clearing. I froze, scanning the shadows. The snapping came again, closer this time, and then a rustle through the underbrush. My mind raced. Could have been a deer or a bear or any number of animals. But the way the sound moved, it didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. I grabbed a long stick, ready to defend myself, though I told myself to stay calm. Animals usually avoid humans if they can. Minutes passed. The rustling stopped. I forced myself to eat a small meal, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The forest seemed to press in closer as the sky darkened. Stars appeared, tiny points of light through the gaps in the canopy. I reminded myself to breathe, to keep calm. But then I heard it again. Low, deliberate footsteps circling the edge of the clearing. I froze, heart pounding. My eyes darted through the darkness, trying to spot any movement. My fire illuminated only a small circle, leaving the edges shrouded in shadow. I felt completely exposed, and the isolation was suffocating. I realized I had made a critical mistake. I had underestimated the remoteness. If someone was out there, they could easily approach without being seen until they were close. I considered packing up and leaving immediately, but it was too dark to navigate safely. The trail back was rocky, and the forest was dense. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to think rationally. I grabbed my backpack and carefully checked my supplies. Water, food, flashlight, knife. I kept the fire low, not wanting to draw attention. The footsteps were still moving, slow and deliberate. I held my breath each time I heard them, listening for any clue about direction. Hours passed. I barely slept, dozing in short bursts, fire crackling beside me, ears straining for any noise. Occasionally, I thought I saw shadows moving between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. My imagination tried to fill in the gaps, but the fear was real. I realized that the danger wasn't just animals, it was humans. Someone could be hiding in the forest, watching, waiting for the right moment. The thought made me shiver. I resolved to be ready to defend myself if necessary. Morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky. The forest looked entirely different in daylight, less menacing but still isolating. I cautiously surveyed the clearing. No one was there. The footprints from the previous day were gone, erased by overnight moisture. I took a moment to calm myself, sipping water and eating a small breakfast. Then I packed my tent and gear, deciding to move along the trail and find a safer spot. I kept my knife within reach and my senses alert. Every sound, the wind in the branches, a bird calling, water trickling, was a signal I had to interpret. I moved carefully, scanning the underbrush, sticking to slightly more open terrain. By midday, I had reached a point where I could hear distant traffic, a faint reminder of civilization. Relief flooded through me. I kept going until I found a more traveled trail, where hikers occasionally passed. I stayed on the main trail, moving quickly but cautiously. Around late afternoon, I reached a ranger station. I reported the strange footprints, the circling noises, and the feeling of being watched. The ranger nodded seriously, noting that others had reported similar experiences in that section of the forest recently. Apparently, there had been reports of people camping illegally and wandering the woods near the trailheads. My encounter had likely been one of these individuals. I was shaken but safe. I spent the night at a nearby official campsite, surrounded by other hikers and families. The sense of security was overwhelming. The next day, I packed up and drove home. I reflected on what had happened. The fear, the isolation, the adrenaline, and the constant awareness that I was completely alone in a remote forest. The experience had been terrifying, but it had also taught me a lot about preparation, caution, and respect for the wilderness. I realized that no matter how experienced or careful you are, nature and human unpredictability can combine to create a situation that is genuinely frightening. I left the forest with a renewed appreciation for safety, the value of planning, and the simple relief of reaching a place where I was no longer alone. Even now, months later, I think back to that night in the clearing, the way the shadows seemed to move just beyond my firelight, the silence that pressed against me, and the footprints in the mud. It was a reminder that the forest is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. And sometimes the most terrifying moments are not those imagined, but those very real, quietly unfolding moments when you are completely alone, and you realize you are not entirely alone. I had planned this camping trip for months. It wasn't supposed to be anything complicated. Just me, my gear, and the forest. I was coming off a long stretch of work, feeling burned out and desperate for some silence. The kind of silence that comes when the world is far away, when the only sounds are the wind in the trees, the water in the creek, and maybe the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. I thought I was ready. I thought I was careful. I thought I knew what I was doing. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning. The air smelled like wet earth, even though the sun was out and the sky was clear. I loaded my pack and started up the trail. At first, it was all easy walking. Soft dirt under my boots, low branches brushing against my shoulders, the smell of pine filling the air. Birds called from somewhere high above, and for the first hour, I felt that lightness you get when you know you've left the world behind. I had chosen this trail because it led deep into the forest, a place few people went. The map showed a small creek and a clearing about 5 miles in, where I planned to set up camp. I had read reports that it was a quiet spot, no one around for miles, just trees and a small water source. Perfect. As the hours passed, the trail became less distinct. Roots and rocks made footing tricky, and patches of mud slowed me down. The sun began to angle lower, the air cooler, and shadows lengthened between the trees. I could hear the creek before I saw it, a faint trickling that grew louder as I neared the clearing. I felt a strange unease, a twinge of awareness, but I chalked it up to fatigue and the sense of being alone. The clearing was smaller than I expected. Tall grass bordered the creek, and the trees around it were thick and dense. I dropped my pack and began setting up my tent. I picked a flat patch of ground, cleared sticks and rocks, and hammered in the stakes. By the time the sun was low on the horizon, the tent was up, my gear organized, and the small fire pit I had cleared ready for the evening. I felt accomplished, like a survivor, like someone who had mastered this little slice of wilderness. I ate a simple dinner, energy bars and dried meat, drank water from my bottle, and sat on a rock beside the creek. The sound of running water was hypnotic, calming. I thought about the night ahead, about crawling into my sleeping bag, listening to the forest breathe around me. I didn't notice the first sign that something was off. It was a subtle noise at first, a snapping of a branch somewhere across the creek. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. I reminded myself it could be a deer or a raccoon, maybe even a stray dog that had wandered in from a nearby road. I tried to focus on the calm, the fire, the creek, but my mind refused to settle. I built up the fire more than I normally would. Sparks flew into the night air, the flames licking higher. I ate another energy bar, telling myself I was fine. And for a while, the forest seemed peaceful again. The shadows of the trees stretched long and dark around the clearing, the stars beginning to twinkle through the canopy above. Then I heard it again, steps. Heavy, deliberate, not quick like an animal. Somewhere along the edge of the clearing, something was moving. Not running, not scampering. Walking slowly, carefully. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the tree line. Nothing. No eyes reflecting the beam. No shape moving. I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't one to panic, but being alone in a forest at night changes everything. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch becomes magnified. I considered packing up and heading back, but it was already dark, and the trail back was rough. I didn't know what was out there, and I knew moving in the dark was dangerous. I grabbed my knife, now fully aware that I was alone in a vast forest, and I didn't know who or what was approaching. The fire had diminished to a low glow, and the shadows it cast were long and flickering. Then I saw it, a figure partially obscured by trees, just standing there at the edge of the clearing. It was impossible to make out details in the darkness, but the shape was human, tall, broad-shouldered. I froze, trying not to breathe too loudly, not to move. I realized quickly that confrontation wasn't my choice. I needed to stay safe. Slowly, I reached for my backpack and pulled out my headlamp. Flicking it on, I aimed it toward the figure. The sudden light revealed a man, rugged and unshaven, wearing a dark jacket. He didn't speak, didn't make a move, just stared. Fear gripped me, cold and hard, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I backed into the tent slightly, putting the fire between us as a barrier. The man didn't move. I considered my options. Running could provoke him. Staying put could make me vulnerable. I remembered the small bear spray I had packed, not for bears but as a defensive tool. Slowly, I reached for it, keeping my eyes fixed on him. He shifted slightly but still didn't speak. The forest was silent again, except for the distant sound of leaves rustling under his feet. Then, unexpectedly, he turned and walked away. He didn't run, didn't glance back. He just disappeared into the darkness, into the trees. My body remained rigid with tension long after he was gone. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of him. Nothing. I waited, hour after hour, until the first hints of dawn began to filter through the trees. Morning brought no sign of him, but it didn't erase the unease. I packed up quickly, leaving behind the fire and all traces of my presence in the clearing. I moved cautiously along the trail, eyes constantly scanning for any movement. I stuck to the main path this time, avoiding side trails or shortcuts. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush set my heart racing. By mid-morning, I reached a small river that I recognized from the map. I drank from my water bottle and filled it up again. I paused briefly to rest, still alert, still listening for any signs of the man from the night before. None came. Slowly, a sense of relief began to seep in. I wasn't completely safe, but the immediate threat had passed. The hike back to the road took hours. I moved deliberately, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, constantly aware of my surroundings. By late afternoon, I could see the first cars parked near the trailhead. The sound of engines, voices, and distant music felt surreal after the oppressive silence of the forest. I walked onto the asphalt road, feeling the relief of civilization wash over me in a wave. I stopped at a small convenience store on the way back to town, buying a soda and sitting outside for a while. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man from the forest emerge from the trees behind the store, but he didn't. I realized that I had survived not because of luck alone, but because I had stayed calm, alert, and cautious. I had prepared for isolation, for discomfort, for fear, and it had paid off. Back home, I unpacked my gear carefully, checking every item, making notes for the next trip. I felt shaken but alive. The fear of the unknown, the realization of how vulnerable I had been, stayed with me for days. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, of resilience. I had faced the forest alone, and I had come back. I had faced a real threat, not imagined or mythical, but real and human, and I had survived it through vigilance and level-headedness. In the weeks that followed, I kept returning mentally to that clearing, to the way the firelight flickered on the trees, to the man at the edge of the forest. It became a reminder. No matter how prepared we are, life can still throw dangers our way in moments of isolation. But preparedness, patience, and awareness make the difference between survival and disaster. I never went back to that exact clearing. I mapped other areas, found new trails, stayed closer to civilization while still seeking solitude. But the experience changed me. It taught me to respect the forest, to respect the unknown, to prepare for what might come, and to stay calm when it does. Fear had been real, but so had the lessons, and they stayed with me. I had planned this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple escape from the city, just me, my backpack, and the wilderness. I wanted to leave behind the noise, the constant pressure of work, the never-ending obligations that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. The idea was simple. Drive a few hours out of town, find a trailhead, hike to a remote spot, set up my tent, and spend 3 days in the forest completely alone. It sounded peaceful in theory, and I had done solo camping before, but nothing had prepared me for what this trip would become. The morning I left, I woke before sunrise. There was a chill in the air, and the sky was that soft, pale gray of early November. I loaded my car carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, first aid kit, extra layers. I double-checked everything, even though I had gone over my list 3 times already. Something about being thorough gave me a sense of control, a buffer against the unpredictability of nature. I drove out of the city slowly, watching the streets empty as the sun rose. The forest I was heading toward was a few hours away, a section of national forest land known for its dense trees, winding trails, and rocky hills. It was not a heavily trafficked area. Most people stuck to the main campsites, but I wanted solitude. I wanted the kind of quiet where you could hear the wind in the trees and your own heartbeat. By mid-morning, I had reached the trailhead. The parking area was nearly empty, save for a single truck with its windows fogged over. I didn't pay much attention to it. People left their cars here for all sorts of reasons. I strapped on my backpack and started walking. The trail was narrow and rocky at first, then opened into a dirt path lined with thick pines and oaks. The smell of wet leaves and pine needles was strong, a damp, earthy scent that filled my senses. I moved at a steady pace, not rushing but not lingering either. My goal was a small clearing about 8 miles in, where I had spotted a flat area near a stream on the map. It wasn't marked on any official trail guides, so I knew it would likely be empty. By late afternoon, I was deep in the woods. The sun was beginning to tilt toward the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees. I reached a section of trail where the path split unexpectedly. Both directions were faintly worn, and the trail markers were few. I paused, trying to determine which way was correct. I pulled out my map and compass, double-checked my GPS, and finally decided on the left path. It seemed slightly more traveled and led closer to the contour lines of the clearing I had identified. I kept walking, my boots crunching over fallen leaves and small branches. As I continued, I noticed the silence grow heavier. Not the soft, comforting silence of the forest, but a tense, pressing quiet. There were no birds, no rustling of squirrels, not even the faint hum of insects. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just late afternoon and the animals were quieter now. I reached a small stream and knelt to fill my water bottle, listening to the soft trickle of water over rocks. The sound was soothing, a reminder that life still existed here. I drank slowly, enjoying the taste of cold, clean water. I had about 2 miles left to reach the clearing when I noticed something strange. The trail ahead, usually marked with small orange ribbons tied to branches by previous hikers, was almost completely bare. I hadn't realized how isolated this area truly was until that moment. There was a fallen log across the path, but it looked like it had been there for a long time. I stepped over it carefully, trying not to lose balance on the wet leaves. Then I saw the first real sign that something wasn't right. Footprints. Not small animal tracks, but human footprints, muddied and deep. They were irregular, not following the trail neatly, almost as if someone had been wandering or running through the woods without concern for a path. I froze, my stomach tightening. The prints looked recent. Rain had fallen the night before, and the soil was soft. These prints were fresh. I considered turning back, but my sense of determination pushed me forward. The clearing was close. If I could just reach it, I would be safe. I reminded myself I had a phone and a GPS, though reception was spotty in these woods. The prints continued alongside the trail, sometimes disappearing into the underbrush and reappearing farther ahead. I slowed my pace, paying close attention to every sound. My heart began to race with a dull, mounting fear. The sun was lower now, and shadows stretched like fingers across the path. Hours passed like this. The sound would move closer, then retreat, then come back again. At one point, I heard a heavy thud against the side of the tent. Not violent, but deliberate, like something testing the fabric. I held my breath, praying it would move away. When it didn't, I realized that staying in the tent might be worse than trying to leave. I waited until the noise moved farther away and then slowly unzipped the flap. My flashlight illuminated a thin strip of ground. Nothing. No movement. No tracks. I took a careful step outside. The forest was silent now, almost too silent. I made the decision to pack up quietly and head back down the trail before dawn. I didn't want to risk a confrontation if the animal returned. I moved slowly, keeping my eyes and ears open. My backpack was heavy, and my legs ached from the climb, but the adrenaline kept me alert. About 15 minutes into my descent, I heard the sound again. Close this time. I froze. The underbrush snapped, and I caught a glimpse of a large, dark shape weaving through the trees. It was massive, easily taller than me if it stood upright. My heart hammered in my chest. I remembered the advice of experienced hikers. Never run blindly in the forest, especially at night. Predators can outrun humans easily in dense terrain. So I moved carefully, keeping the flashlight pointed ahead, stepping over roots and rocks. The sound followed, never too close, but never leaving. I could feel the presence, the weight of it, like something was circling me, studying me, waiting. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I had made it to a flatter section of the trail. I could see the valley below and the road that led back to civilization, still far away, but visible. I picked up the pace cautiously, scanning constantly for movement. The noise had stopped, but I knew that meant nothing. Predators are quiet, and they wait for the right moment. I finally emerged onto the old dirt road that led to the highway. My body was sore, my hands scratched from brushing against branches, my clothes damp with dew and sweat. I looked back into the forest once, half expecting to see the shadow of the animal at the tree line, but there was nothing. I started walking, then jogging, then running until I reached my car. The relief was overwhelming. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't stop until I was back in the city, lights of the town shining through the misty morning. I didn't go back to that spot. I never will. Weeks later, I researched reports of wildlife in that area. Locals mentioned a large black bear that had been in the region for several years, unusually aggressive and known for wandering near campsites in search of food. The description fit what I had seen perfectly. The tracks, the size, the methodical circling, it all made sense now. I realized that I had been lucky. That night, the bear had been cautious, maybe curious, maybe hungry. If it had attacked, there would have been no chance. I also understood the mistake I had made, underestimating the wilderness. Planning, gear, maps, they are important, but respect for the animals and unpredictability of nature is more important. The memory of that night stayed with me, haunting in its own quiet way. I didn't speak of it much. I didn't need to. The lesson was clear. Nature is beautiful, but it is also indifferent. It does not negotiate. It does not forgive. Since then, I've continued camping, but differently. I study animal behavior. I choose campsites carefully. I carry bear spray and know how to use it. I make noise when moving at night. I keep food far from my sleeping area, and I respect boundaries. The forest is still a place of peace for me, but the memory of that night remains, a reminder of the raw, unfiltered reality of the wild. That encounter could have ended badly. Didn't. I consider that not luck, but a hard-earned lesson, one that will never leave me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can picture the shape moving at the edge of the clearing, the low sniffing sound, the dragging of paws through mud and leaves. It was real, it was terrifying, and it reminded me that out there, in the quiet, in the dark, I was not the only presence and I was never truly in control. But I survived. And survival, I realized, is its own victory. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the mountains, to the way the wind whispered through the trees and the smell of pine needles filled the air. Camping had become my escape, the one way I could leave the chaos of everyday life behind and feel something pure and grounded. I had planned this trip for weeks, packing everything meticulously. My tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra fuel, food, water, first aid kit, and tools. I had a small backpack with essentials and a larger pack for all my gear. The location was a remote part of a national forest I had never been to before, a place I found on a map where the trails ended and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly without interruption. My plan was simple. Hike in, set up camp near a small river I had spotted on the topographic map, spend 3 days in the wilderness, and hike back out. The first day was as I expected. The air was crisp, the sun bright, and the forest smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. I moved slowly, carrying my pack over uneven terrain, stopping often to catch my breath and admire the streams and rock formations. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the distant sound of water running over rocks provided a constant, gentle backdrop. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing I had chosen for my campsite. It was a small flat area just above the riverbank, sheltered by a line of tall pines and some thick undergrowth. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the ground underneath was flat and free of rocks. I stacked firewood I found nearby and gathered dry kindling to start a fire later that evening. The first night was peaceful. I ate some canned beans I had heated over the small camp stove and drank water from my bottle, careful not to disturb the wildlife with any strong smells. As darkness fell, I built a fire, small and controlled, its flames flickering against the shadows of the trees. I watched the fire burn, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was alive with the low murmurs of night insects, the occasional snapping of twigs, and the subtle movements of creatures I could not see. I felt a deep sense of calm, a rare feeling in my normally hectic life. The second day, I decided to hike further upstream. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and a map, leaving the rest of my gear at the campsite. The trail along the river was rougher than I expected. Moss covered the rocks, making them slippery, and fallen branches blocked parts of the path. Every few minutes, I had to step carefully, balancing myself with my hiking pole. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, and I started to notice small signs of animal life. Broken branches, footprints in the mud, and bird calls that were sharper and more distant. I realized I had moved further from human presence than I had intended. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a narrow gorge where the river had cut deep into the rock. The water flowed faster here, tumbling over boulders, and the mist from the falls coated my arms and face. I climbed along a side trail to get a better view, careful not to slip on the wet stone. From above, the gorge looked almost endless, the forest surrounding it thick and wild. I took some photos, trying to remember this moment, this untouched beauty, before heading back to camp. On my way back, I noticed the light changing rapidly. The sun, once high, was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I felt a subtle shift, a tension in the air that I couldn't quite explain. By the time I returned to my campsite, the forest had transformed. The shadows were darker, the wind had picked up, and the sounds of wildlife had decreased significantly. The fire I had left smoldering was just a pile of ashes, cold now, and the temperature had dropped sharply. I hurried to relight it, stacking the kindling and carefully feeding the flame until it roared to life. That night I slept lightly. The wind rattled my tent, bending the poles and making the fabric flap. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked sharply, and I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. I reminded myself that it was normal. Wild animals, shifting trees, the forest itself. But the feeling of unease lingered. I resolved to be more cautious the next day, to stick close to known trails and avoid wandering too far. The third day began with a clear sky. I decided to hike out in the morning, feeling uneasy after the previous night. I packed my tent and most of my gear, leaving only a small emergency kit behind, and started down the path toward the main trail. The forest was alive again, but there was a tension beneath it. I kept my eyes on the trail, checking every step, aware of how isolated I had become. I tried to settle in the tent. I left my gear in a tight pile beside me, knife within reach, water bottle in case I had to move quickly. The sounds didn't stop. They got closer. Footsteps around the perimeter of the clearing, circling, pausing. Every so often, a snap of a branch, then silence. I lay there, stomach tight, ears straining. The fire had burned down, leaving only glowing embers. The shadows seemed to move, shifting with the faint wind. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. Sleep didn't come. My mind raced through scenarios. Someone lost in the forest? A hunter? A criminal hiding out? Bears or wolves? I had read about black bears being dangerous near campsites if food was left out. But my food was packed, high and tight in my bag. Still, my thoughts churned. At some point, I heard a low grunt, unmistakably human. A voiceless sound, almost a growl, from just beyond the clearing. My heart leaped into my throat. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible in the tent. The sound repeated, closer now. Not continuous, but deliberate. Someone or something was out there, pacing, waiting. I had to decide quickly. Staying in the tent felt like a trap. The logical choice was to grab my pack, leave the fire, and move back toward the trail. But in the dark, with uneven ground, I risked tripping, twisting an ankle, or worse. My mind ran through every option, and fear made my chest tighten so hard I thought I couldn't breathe. I made a decision. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, careful not to make noise. The moment the flap opened, a shadow moved in the tree-line, just beyond the reach of the weak light. My flashlight beam swept across the edge of the clearing, and I saw a man. Tall, bulky, dressed in dark clothes, crouched low as if watching me. His face was obscured by a hood. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I had to stay calm. I backed slowly toward my pack, grabbing my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. My mind raced. I couldn't outrun him in the darkness. I needed to think, plan, move carefully. The man took a step forward, slow, deliberate. I could hear the dry leaves crackle under his boots. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to focus. I grabbed my pack and swung it over my shoulder, holding my knife ready. Slowly, I began moving toward the edge of the clearing, toward the trees that led back to the trail. Another step. I tightened my grip on the knife. My feet slipped in mud, and I stumbled slightly, sending a spray of dirt behind me. He froze, then shifted, following. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I moved faster, stepping carefully, trying not to trip. The forest was darker than I thought, the moon obscured by clouds. Every sound echoed. I reached a point where the trees thickened. I ducked behind a large trunk, heart hammering, listening. He was close. I could hear the soft rustle of movement. I waited, holding my breath, counting seconds that stretched into minutes. When he didn't move, I darted to the next cover. I kept moving like that, zigzagging through trees, trying to stay quiet, trying to stay out of sight. My legs ached, lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. Eventually, I found the trail. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I turned and ran, flashlight swinging, backpack bouncing against my back. My knife was still clutched in my hand, ready to defend if necessary. I ran until the tree line began to thin, until I could see the lights of a distant road. Somewhere ahead, I heard the faint hum of cars. I stumbled onto the roadside, exhausted, mud caked on my boots, sweat running down my face. I flagged down the first car I saw, a stranger who pulled over immediately. I gave them my location, told them I had been camping and felt threatened, and they called the police. The officers arrived within 20 minutes, flashlight beams cutting through the trees, cars parked along the roadside. They searched the area and eventually found footprints circling the clearing where I had camped. The man was gone, but they assured me he had likely fled once he realized someone was awake and alert. I was shaken but safe. I packed my gear into my car, mud-streaked and torn, and drove home. I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly the situation had escalated, how vulnerable I had been. I realized how lucky I had been to have planned carefully. My knife, flashlight, and staying alert had given me a chance. Back home, I scrubbed the mud from my boots, cleaned my gear, and sat down. The forest was quiet again in my memory, peaceful even, but I knew I would never look at it the same way. The isolation I had sought for peace had turned into terror. The experience stayed with me, but it also taught me something vital. Preparation, awareness, and calm thinking are the only things that can save you when danger comes unexpectedly. I returned to camping later, more cautious, more aware, but I never forgot that night. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable, and you are never truly alone. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, is a reminder that the world can be dangerous, and only your wits and preparation can keep you safe. That night, I learned to respect that truth more than anything else. I had been planning this trip for months. I had scouted the area, bought the gear, and double-checked my supplies. I needed this camping trip to be alone, away from people, away from noise, away from the constant demands of work and life. The plan was simple. Find a remote site in the forest, set up camp, hike a bit, fish if I could, and spend 3 days alone. I wanted silence, the kind that presses down on you, the kind that lets your mind wander freely. I had no idea how quickly that silence could turn into something entirely different. I started early in the morning, loading my old backpack with the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, water, stove, cooking gear, and my first aid kit. I also carried a small hatchet and a folding knife for emergencies. My phone was fully charged, though I knew it probably wouldn't work once I was deep in the forest. The drive was long but quiet, the roads winding past hills and rivers, trees growing thick on either side. Every mile I drove felt like shedding layers of the city, layers of human presence, and stepping into the rawness of nature. I felt a nervous excitement in my chest, a mixture of freedom and anticipation. I reached the trailhead around mid-morning. I parked my car, checked my backpack, and began the hike. The trail was narrow and mostly overgrown. I pushed branches aside and stepped carefully over roots and rocks. The air smelled clean, earthy, damp with morning dew. Birds chirped intermittently, and the wind moved softly through the trees. At first, it was calming, almost hypnotic, like the forest was welcoming me. I walked steadily, following the small creek that ran alongside the trail. I kept a mental note of the landmarks so I could find my way back, marking trees with small scratches on the bark, careful not to damage them too much. By early afternoon, I reached a small clearing I had noticed on the map. It was perfect for a campsite. Surrounded by trees on 3 sides, with a little meadow in the middle, the ground was mostly flat, and a small stream ran just a few meters away. I set down my backpack and began unpacking. I cleared the ground of rocks and sticks, laying down my ground tarp and pitching the tent. Every movement felt methodical, precise, almost ritualistic. I hammered in the stakes, stretched the tent fabric tight, and checked the lines. Once it was secure, I arranged my sleeping bag and supplies inside. Everything had a place, and I took satisfaction in the organization. After setting up, I decided to explore a bit. I wandered along the stream, checking for fish and looking at the water's edge for signs of animal activity. There were tracks, deer, maybe raccoon, possibly even a coyote, but nothing alarming. The forest was alive, and I was a small part of it. I collected some firewood while walking back to camp, careful to gather only dry branches that would catch quickly. By the time I returned, the sun was lower, filtering through the trees in golden beams. I set up my small portable stove, cooked a simple meal of rice and canned vegetables, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the fresh air. As night began to fall, the forest changed. Shadows stretched long and deep between the trees. The sounds shifted. Birds went silent, and the wind made the leaves whisper in a way that sounded like movement deeper in the woods. I built a small fire with the wood I had collected, careful to keep it contained. The light and warmth made the clearing feel safer, but there was an awareness now, a tension I hadn't noticed in the daylight. Alone in the woods, even the familiar can feel strange. I decided to take a short walk down the trail to familiarize myself with the surroundings before night fully set in. The forest looked different under the dim light, every tree and bush casting elongated shadows. I kept the fire at my back, and every step I took on the trail felt louder than it should have. Then I noticed it, a rustling sound, subtle at first, like a branch bending under weight. I froze. The wind wasn't strong, so it had to be something alive. I waited, listening. The rustling stopped. My heart beat a little faster. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, anything but a human. I walked slowly back, making sure I left the fire visible in case someone or something approached. That night, sleep was uneasy. The sounds of the forest were unfamiliar in the darkness. Branches creaked, small animals scuttled in the underbrush, and the occasional splash in the stream reminded me I was entirely alone. I kept my knife within reach and my flashlight charged. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by every little noise. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps approaching the clearing. I sat up, heart pounding, listening intently. Nothing followed. I stayed awake for hours, eyes darting to every shadow, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I decided to hike further along the trail. I packed a small day bag with water, some food, my knife, and a rope. The trail became narrower, steeper, and less traveled. It felt remote in a way that excited and unnerved me at the same time. I climbed a small ridge and looked back at the clearing. The tent was tiny from the distance, and the smoke from the fire I had left burning in the morning mist was barely visible. I felt small, insignificant, a visitor in a world that didn't need me. I explored for hours, taking note of the terrain, rocks, and trees that could serve as landmarks. The forest floor was uneven, covered with loose soil, moss, and fallen leaves. Every step required attention. I realized quickly that a misstep could mean a twisted ankle or worse, far from help. I drank water from the stream and rested under the shade of a large oak. The sun filtered through the canopy in patterns that made the ground look like it was moving. I found animal tracks, some fresh, some older, and for a moment, I thought about how easily an encounter could turn dangerous. A coyote or a bear could find me far from the camp, and no one would know where I was. Around midday, clouds began rolling in. The temperature dropped, and the smell of wet earth signaled rain. I decided to head back, keeping the forest trail in sight. The wind picked up, making the branches sway and the undergrowth rustle more aggressively. The trail was muddier than I expected, and my boots slipped several times. I focused on every step, aware that losing balance here could have serious consequences. When I finally saw the clearing again, I felt relief I hadn't realized I needed. The tent was still standing. The fire smoldered but had died down overnight. That evening, I prepared a larger fire, knowing the temperature would drop further. I cooked my meal and ate quietly, listening to the rain begin to patter on the leaves. The forest was dark now, shadows blending into each other, the only light coming from my fire. I stayed alert, watching the tree line, listening for anything unusual. Around midnight, I thought I heard voices in the distance, but I was alone for miles. I strained to hear, and then the sounds shifted, something heavier, slower. It wasn't human conversation. Something was moving through the underbrush. My mind raced. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the forest edge. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted, circling, stopping, starting again. I kept the fire between me and the noise, knowing animals are cautious around light and fire. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound was amplified: the wind, the rain, the occasional snap of a branch under weight. My mind kept returning to the possibilities. A bear, a wild boar, or even a hunter I hadn't noticed. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. I knew I had to be careful packing up, moving slowly and staying alert. The final day, I decided to break camp and hike back toward the car. I packed methodically, leaving no trace of my presence, collecting every piece of trash and leftover food. I double-checked the tent, folded it carefully, and carried everything in my backpack. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest damp and slippery. The mud made the hike more difficult. I followed the trail I had mapped out, marking trees discreetly so I would not get lost. My body ached from the hike, the backpack, and the tension of staying alert for 3 days straight. As I descended the trail toward the parking area, I noticed a recent set of human footprints in the mud. They were large, possibly a hiker, but I had not passed anyone, and the trail was isolated. The footprints seemed fresh, and they moved in the same direction I was heading. A subtle fear crawled over me. I considered taking a different route, but the trail I had taken in was the safest way. I kept moving, stepping carefully, keeping an eye on the prints as they faded. My pulse remained elevated until I finally reached the car. Relief washed over me, a weight lifting from my chest. I double-checked that all my gear was secure, loaded everything in, and started the engine. Driving back on the winding forest road, I felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The trip had been everything I wanted and more. Solitude, immersion in nature, challenge, and a confrontation with my own fears. The forest was a place of beauty and danger, and I had experienced both. I reflected on the tension, the anxiety, the moments where I had questioned my safety, and realized that being alone in nature demanded respect, attention, and preparation. I felt a quiet pride in navigating the isolation safely, knowing I had faced real challenges without panic, relying on my wits and careful planning. By the time I reached the main highway, sunlight was filtering through the clouds, warming the damp earth and drying the roads. I stopped at a small diner to eat and shake off the stress, feeling more grounded with every step. I had survived the wilderness alone, with nothing but my instincts and preparation. The forest had tested me, and I had met the test. Driving home, I understood that this experience would stay with me forever. The quiet moments, the tension, the realization of how small and vulnerable I was in the vast forest. It had changed me. I knew I would return someday, better prepared and with a deeper respect for the solitude and the danger that comes with it. For now, I was content, tired, and safe, carrying a vivid memory of a raw, beautiful, and challenging wilderness adventure that I would never forget. I had planned this solo camping trip for months, carefully picking a remote spot in the mountains where there was little human traffic. I wanted to escape the constant noise of the city, to breathe in air that wasn't tainted by cars or smoke, to hear nothing but wind in the trees and the sound of my own footsteps on the trail. I thought I was prepared. I had a sturdy tent, a high-quality sleeping bag, a backpack stuffed with enough food, water, and supplies for a week, and a small first aid kit tucked into the side pocket. I even had a satellite phone in case of emergencies, though I didn't expect to need it. The hike to the campsite had been longer than I expected. I had chosen a trail that wound through dense forest, rocky outcrops, and small streams. The path was narrow in places, covered in wet leaves that made it slippery, and I had to climb over fallen logs and squeeze through thick brush. By the time I reached the site in the late afternoon, my legs were sore, my backpack felt heavier than ever, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. But the view from the clearing where I decided to pitch my tent made it all worth it. The campsite sat on the edge of a small plateau overlooking a valley, the kind of place where the sun hit just right in the evening, casting long shadows across the trees. I set up my tent carefully, checking every stake, making sure it was level and secure. I stacked some firewood I had collected nearby, and then I sat down to drink water and eat a small meal of granola and jerky. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. The forest was alive with sounds I hadn't noticed during the hike: rustling leaves, the distant snap of a twig, the faint buzz of insects. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind moving through the trees, feeling both calm and alert. I had told myself that being alone in the wilderness was something I could handle, and at first it was peaceful. But as darkness deepened, small noises became larger in my mind. Every crack of a branch sounded like someone moving nearby. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something heavy moving through the forest near my tent. My first thought was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was different from anything I had heard before. Slower, deliberate, with a weight that suggested a large creature. I stayed very still, straining to hear. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. My heart was racing, and I tried to tell myself that I wasn't imagining it, that it was probably a bear or a wild boar. I reached for my flashlight and shined it out of the tent, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I knew I should stay calm and make noise, maybe bang on a pan or shout to scare it off, but my body felt frozen. Then I heard it, a low grunt, almost human in its timing, but deeper and harsher, coming from somewhere between the trees and the edge of the clearing. I remembered the advice I had read about bear encounters. Make yourself look bigger, back away slowly, don't run. But my mind was racing with scenarios I hadn't prepared for. I turned on my phone's GPS and checked the map, realizing that the nearest ranger station was over 6 miles away down a trail I had only partially hiked. Calling for help was an option, but I knew the signal could be weak. For the next few hours, I barely slept, listening to the sounds outside. Every noise made me jolt. Every shadow seemed alive. I tried to keep busy, organizing my backpack, checking my supplies, reading the emergency instructions for animal encounters. By the first light of dawn, I had calmed enough to venture outside, but cautiously, keeping my flashlight and a stick in hand. I saw the tracks immediately, large, heavy, and deep, set in a semicircle around my campsite. I had been surrounded overnight. The prints were too big for a deer or a wild boar. They belonged to something larger, and the spacing suggested it was slow and deliberate. I realized how vulnerable I had been.